Okay guys, today I want to talk about the 5 factors that can lead to evolution. This is basically just a summary of what we talked about last week. So if we start off with our initial population here, then the 5 factors are genetic drift, which is, remember, that's going to cause a decrease in the amount of genetic variation that we have because the population has grown smaller due to chance or some random event. Gene flow, which is going to be increasing our genetic variation because we have new genes coming in and some genes leaving. The next one is mutation. So this is how we get new alleles and variation in our population. Next one is sexual selection, where females are preferring a certain trait over another. And then the last one, of course, is natural selection, where nature is basically allowing the best suited traits to survive, and those are the ones that get passed on to offspring. So now we're going to talk about the process of speciation, and this is how new species come to be. So the way that we define a species, as you remember back to the previous unit, we learned that a species is when organisms can breed and produce fertile offspring. And so when we say interbreed, that means they're breeding with each other. Okay, so new species will arise whenever a population is isolated. And there's a number of ways that they can be isolated, so we're going to be talking about those today. And as these populations adapt their environments, their gene pools might change. And that could be caused from random processes like mutations or genetic drift. Those could change the gene pool as well. So over time, as genetic changes are adding up, that's when we're going to see speciation beginning to occur. Those populations are going to become more and more genetically different from each other. So reproductive isolation is the first type of isolation, and this is where members of different populations can no longer mate successfully. They're isolated from each other reproductively. And so whenever this happens, that's the final step of speciation, and they are officially 2 different species now. So let's talk about what leads to reproductive isolation. There's 3 basic barriers. The first is behavioral barriers, and just as it sounds, it's something to do with behaviors that prevents them from reproducing. So this is when members will develop different behaviors, and that's going to keep them from interbreeding. So this might be differences in how they court or trying to attract their mates, so different mating rituals, that kind of thing, mating dances, mating songs. So the example is male and female fireflies will produce patterns of flashes that attract mates of their own species, and if they don't do the right patterns of flashes, then the female will be uninterested. The second type of barrier is geographic, and so this is where the earth or land barriers will physically prevent the population from getting to each other. And so this can be caused by anything from rivers to mountains to lake beds, just any type of physical barrier that keeps them apart. And so an example is that salamanders in California have been blocked geographically, and because of that, now they have different color patterns. Third is temporal barriers, and temp has to do with time. So these are barriers that involve timing. And so this is where some type of timing problem keeps them from reproducing with each other. So maybe it's a different part of the day or a different time of the year when they're ready to mate, but some type of timing keeps them from mating. So an example is the Monterey pine will shed its pollen in February, and then the bishop pine will shed its pollen in April. And so because of that, they're being pollinated at different times, and so they're not going to be able to reproduce with each other. Let's apply your knowledge now. So number 1 says, what type of isolation refers to the fact that 2 crickets do not interbreed because one matures in the spring and the other matures in the fall? Take a minute and answer that one. All right, so we should notice that this is talking about the spring and the fall. That has to do with timing. So that type of isolation is temporal. Okay? All right, second one. Finches throughout the Galapagos Islands differed greatly due to which type of isolation? Take a minute to answer that one. All right, you should have noticed that it's talking about the islands, so they're going to be separated by gaps of water, and so this one is geographic. All right, the third one, the whistle-like call of the eastern meadowlark can be easily distinguished from the flute-like call of its western cousin. This difference serves as a cue and prevents members of both populations from mating with each other. What type of isolation is this an example of? All right, so we see that they have a specific type of mating call, and so that is a behavior. So this is a behavioral isolation. So evolution occurs in patterns. So let's look at some of the patterns that we see. So evolution through natural selection is not random. Like I mentioned, it occurs in patterns. So the effects of natural selection add up over many generations and will push a population's traits in an advantageous direction. So the first example of this is convergent evolution. And so when we see something converge, that means that they're becoming more and more similar. These similar traits develop because an organism lives in a similar environment as another organism. So with a shark and a dolphin, they both live in the water, they both need to be able to swim, and so even though they came from very distantly related species, they develop very similar traits. So those are analogous structures. Think back to what an analogous structure is. You should recall that they have the same function, but different structure. And so whenever we see analogous structures, we need to remember that those are distantly related species. So please make sure that you underline distantly related species and analogous structures, and that you know that those are both examples of convergent evolution. The second example is divergent evolution, which is also known as adaptive radiation. You will need to know both of those terms together. So let's kind of break those up a little bit. So the term diverge means that two lines are moving away from each other. So if you look at this cladogram over here, you see that the lines are splitting into two. Those are diverging. Over here again, we see another one that diverges into the emu and the ostrich. So that's divergent evolution. Adaptive radiation, this means that the adaptations are radiating into different species. Okay, so this is when closely related species evolve in different directions to become increasingly different. And you'd expect to see homologous structures when we're talking about divergent evolution. So think back to what a homologous structure is. You should recall that it's the same structure with different functions. So if we look over here at this cladogram, sorry, there's a bell. There are the same bone structures in the crocodile, the emu, the ostrich, the chicken, etc., but they have diverged into different species. Another example of this is the finches on Darwin's Island. That's the classic example of adaptive radiation. All right, let's test your skills in understanding the difference between convergent and divergent evolution. So this first one right here, we're looking at a dolphin and a shark. It says both of these are mammals. Dolphins are mammals and sharks are fish, and they've evolved similar tail fins as each has adapted to similar environmental conditions. So the question is, what type of structures are the dolphin and shark tail fins? Are they homologous or are they analogous? All right, you should have answered analogous. The key here is that they did not evolve from a common ancestor, but they have evolved to have the same function to be able to swim. So that's analogous. Let's look at our other example, which is divergent evolution. So we have the kit fox and the red fox, and they evolved from a common ancestor while adapting to different environments. So what type of structures would you expect to see here with divergent evolution? You should have said homologous. So the clue here is that they have a common ancestor and they are adapting to different environments. And so they're going to have those adaptations radiate into different structures to be able to adapt to their environment. The third pattern that we see is coevolution. And what does co mean? It means together. So this is when two species evolve together. An example of this is the Madagascar star orchid. This is a flower that has a really, really long tube where the nectar is down at the very bottom. It's almost a foot long. And so Darwin made a prediction looking at this flower about what kind of insect or bird could possibly pollinate it. And so he suspected that there was a moth with a really, really long tongue called a proboscis to be able to reach the nectar at the bottom. So he was exactly right about this, and once this video recording is over, I'm going to show you a video that describes this discovery. We've talked about how species form. Now we're going to talk about how species can become extinct. So just as birth and death are natural events in the life of an individual, the rise and fall of species are also natural processes of evolution. So anytime that we have the elimination of a species, that's known as extinction, which I'm sure you're aware of. So this will usually occur when a species as a whole is unable to adapt to a change in its environment. And we have two types of extinctions. The first is a background extinction, and this is where extinctions occur continuously but at a really low rate, as if it's something in the background. The next type is a mass extinction, and this is when extinctions occur suddenly in geological time, and it's usually because of a catastrophic event like an ice age or an asteroid impact. The last pattern of speciation that we're going to discuss is found in the fossil record. And so there's two specific types of patterns that are found in the fossil record, and the first is gradualism, and this is where evolutionary changes occur over a long period of time, and these changes happen very gradually. The second type is punctuated equilibrium. So think back, equilibrium, that means for something to be at a balance or equal, very stable. And so punctuated, if a sentence has a lot of punctuations in it, that means that there's pauses or an emphasis or something like that. So this is where there's bursts of change that break up the stability of that species, and it changes, and then it goes back to being stable. So there's bursts of evolutionary activity followed by long periods of stability or stasis. Looking a little bit more closely at gradualism, in gradualism we see that speciation generally occurs uniformly through the steady and gradual transformation of the whole lineage. So what we would see here is that the speciation or forming of new species would be a smooth and continuous process, meaning that a big change happened from many cumulative small changes. As you can see down here, this would be the ancestor of these two different species of butterflies, and there were very small changes that occurred over a period of time and eventually led to this species. And then over here we have other changes that were very small and eventually led to this species, and we end up with two different species that diverged very gradually. And so this is supported in the fossil record, looking at fossils of horses. There's many intermediate forms that connect the ancestral species of the horse to the modern horse. Next, let's look at punctuated equilibrium. So this can occur when some outside force, like a catastrophe, causes a disruption to a stable ecosystem. So after this catastrophe, the organisms that are able to evolve quickly are more likely to survive. So we'll usually see one species quickly dividing and diverging into different species, followed by long periods of no evolution. So this one butterfly evolved into two different species of butterflies, and then they became very stable. And so an example of this is the volcanic eruption at Mount St. Helens up in Washington, and because species were isolated from each other, that caused rapid speciation to occur. Okay, that wraps up our notes. Thank you for paying close attention. I hope you learned a lot.